Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Lindia Hayden, and I work in the Office for Diversity and Inclusion. I am a co-lead with Pamela Abner of the Black Women Leaders Employee Resource Group. And we are very happy to have this panel event this month for Women's History Month, although the topic is not just about women. And we have a lot of events. We're recording this event. I'm going to put the URL for us in the chat if you're interested in other events that have been recorded throughout the years. And what I'd like to do is to get started because we have a lot to discuss with you. And we're going to discuss the DISTRUPT Clinical Trials Project, which aims to increase participation of people of color in clinical trials. And today our moderator is Dr. Tamiesha Frempong. She's the assistant professor, not producer, professor in ophthalmology, medical education, and pediatrics at the Icahn School of Medicine. She is also the vice chair of diversity, equity, and inclusion for ophthalmology. And she will introduce the panelists and then they'll talk about themselves. Dr. Frempong?
All right. Well, I'll have our panelists introduce themselves shortly, our esteemed panelists. But before we get into a deep dive into an enlightening conversation, I wanted to ground the discussion with a bit of background and statistics, okay? So I believe we'd all agree that clinical trials are key to the advancement of medicine, right? For cancer, clinical trials can shed light on the most effective means to diagnose, prevent, and treat disease. But it's been well documented that participation by members of the BIPOC community, so that is Black, Indigenous, and people of color in clinical trials, is woefully low. According to a 2022 Lancet publication, which reviewed more than 20,000 US-based clinical trials, only 43% reported any race ethnicity data. And within those, most participants were white. The median number of white participants was 79.7%, while the median number of Black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, American Indian participants were 10%, 6%, 1%, and 0.0% respectively. Conclusions drawn from clinical trials, however, are extrapolated to all members of the population, but cancer may impact one group differently than another. So blanket extrapolation, as we know, can have deadly consequences. So a conversation with Dr. Bickell and Reverend Dr. Costello will shed light on a New York City-based initiative to increase clinical trial participation among BIPOC patients with cancer. So we'll discuss reasons for the low participation rate and the role bias plays in excluding some from clinical trials, why diversity in clinical trials is so important, and barriers to participation and how to overcome them. Let's get into it. All right, so I'm going to have each of our panelists just tell us a little bit about their background and their roles briefly, but then I'd also like them to share one fun fact about themselves. So I know many of us know each other since this is a Mount Sinai community. One fun fact about me is that I happen to be a twin. And my mom did not know she was pregnant with twins, and I was the second twin to be born. So my sister comes first, and then my foot starts poking out, and the doctor says, "Oh my God, there's another one." So that's my entry into the world. That's my fun fact. Dr. Bickell?
Wow, what a wonderful surprise for your parents. Hi, I'm Nina Bickell. I am a primary care doc and a health services researcher. I am a professor in the departments of population health science and policy, and also in medicine. I see patients over at IMA. I've been at Mount Sinai, oh my God, in June it'll be 29 years. My role in DISTRUPT is I'm the PI. And so I do many different things on the project. And fun fact, so fun fact in terms of, I guess, my very first real relationship with East Harlem was when I was 10 years old. I ended up representing the Brooklyn Children's Museum at the East Harlem Summer Music Festival contest at what was then Benjamin Franklin High School. And that's how I ended up getting a scholarship to the Manhattan School of Music.
Amazing. I'd love to hear more about that offline. And Reverend Dr.
Former life.
Yeah. Reverend Dr. Costello.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zorina Costello, and I'm Director of Community Engagement for 2 centers within the Icahn School of Medicine, the Center for Stress, Resilience, and Personal Growth, and the Center for Spirituality and Health. I started first working for the Center for Spirituality and Health in 2013, and then by 2015, I was promoted as Director of Community Engagement. That work has involved working within the communities, mainly of East Harlem and Harlem, and some work in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. And I also work with faith-based organizations throughout that area, and somewhat in Queens. And I'm also on this DISTRUPT project as working alongside Dr. Bickell as a co-investigator. A fun fact, I can't really think of anything, but when I was about 9 years old, my mom was pregnant and we lived on 105th and First. So I grew up pretty near the hospital, and she went into labor and my brother and I were at home, and she left us there. And she said, "Don't worry, Grandma will be here soon. I left you some cold cuts and bread in the refrigerator." So I quickly got into motion of making sandwiches. And when my grandmother arrived, I had a big sandwich in my hand, and I was crying when I opened the door for my grandmother, eating and crying at the same time. And the family never let me forget that.
Of course not. Very cute. All right, guys, let's jump right in. Okay, so my first question is for Dr. Bickell. And so it's asking you to please tell us more about DISTRUPT, which stands for Diversity and Inclusion in Research, Underpinning Prevention and Therapy Trials. And how did it come about? What are the aims? And what metrics do you use to evaluate what you're doing and how effective it is, and what inroads have been made so far?
A lot. Before I dive into this, so Zorina, just as being very modest, Zorina actually is co-leading aim 1, which is the community aim of DISTRUPT. And I'll get into that and let her talk more in detail. But so the first question was, how did it come about?
Yes.
So when I was leading community outreach and education for the Tisch Cancer Institute, I actually had brought together folks from across the city. It's now expanded even beyond that, to create a collaborative of the community outreach and engagement people, figuring that we all needed to do cancer needs assessments for our catchment areas, and that if we pooled our data and our resources and our expertise, we could actually get a much finer, more granular description of what was going on and really figure out how we could partner to target whatever we were finding. And so once we had that group put together, when this RFA came out from Stand Up to Cancer, basically, this was their inaugural RFA looking at health equity. They'd never done that before. They were really focused just on basic science work in curing cancer, which is a big focus. So this was their first foray into health equity. And so I reached out to folks at Columbia and at Einstein, and then later we reached out to folks at City College to really start looking at issues that we all shared, because we actually were serving very similar populations within Northern Manhattan and the Bronx. And so we focused on 3 cancers that had racial disparities in incidence and or mortality, which have changed a bit since we started, but I can go into that later. And we had 3 basic aims. Our idea was to focus on cancer clinical trials for much of the reasons that Misha, you had really talked about, which is that it really is an issue of social justice. And if you want to be sure that the options and the treatments that you are recommending for your patient as an oncologist really work and work well, then you really need to have evidence to back that up. And the challenge that we have is exactly what you were saying, is that representation of diverse communities in cancer clinical trials is woefully low. And while it's possible that some of the findings that we already know about are applicable, it's also possible that they may not work as well. And there's a huge body of literature showing disparities, both in terms of receipt of different treatments, but also in some instances in the impact of those treatments. And so our goal with this, to really be broad and have the potential of a huge impact, was let's really start tackling what's going on in terms of what is impacting recruitment to cancer clinical trials. And so towards that end, we have three different aims. One aim focuses on the community and really disrupting how communities think about clinical trials and clinical research, which became quite clear that there were huge issues, in case we didn't know it before, during COVID, and especially trying to get vaccination rates up. Another aim focuses on the research community and the education piece, and identifying, basically teaching basic science researchers about issues of health equity in cancer and in clinical trials, as well as giving money for pilot funding for studies that are focused on cancer disparities. In order to both build bridges across the different institutions and to bring the community voice and relevance to the community into the kinds of research that we would fund, a basic requirement was to have PIs for each pilot, 2 PIs from 2 of the participating institutions, and a community scientist. And I can get into later what that then led to in the Community Scientists Institute, but just for the overview. So there's teaching of a health equity course and the pilot funding that is part of the focus on the research community. The healthcare delivery group and AIM focuses on really restructuring how we recruit to clinical trials and disrupting how we do that. So right now, the way it works is there is a research nurse for a particular trial, and that nurse goes through the schedule and looks at all the different patients and figures out who fits this trial. We want to turn that on its end and disrupt that. And the way we're looking at it is, let's find patients who are at clinical treatment decision points when clinical trials will be more relevant, and let's find trials that match the patients. And then let's let the docs know about these trials before they sit down with the patient, so that if any of these trials are actually relevant, they can talk to the patient about it. And let's tell the patients about this. So let's teach patients about clinical trials in general, and also send specific information about each of those trials to the patient, and have them bring that list with them when they meet with the doc to stimulate discussion. We send that list to the patient in a few different ways. Embedded in that match list is a link to our website. In our website, we have simplified language describing each of the different trials, so the patient can just click and go to that. And that has a link in it to clinicaltrials.gov that can give even more detailed, but a bit harder to understand information. The information that we send to the docs includes each of those trials, and they get that a day or two before they see the patient. And then we also created a best practice alert to pop up in Epic while they're seeing the patient. That also includes a link to that match list. And the idea behind that was that one of the really important challenges that we wanted to address was to deal with implicit bias. And implicit bias usually or often can get triggered by time pressure. And so all the clinicians on the call will likely know that, you know, when you're seeing patients, and you're just trying to get done everything you need to get done. It's really hard, even though you have the best of intentions, to think about, oh, there's this trial, it may be helpful for this patient, et cetera. But if it kind of comes up in your face when you're talking to the patient, that should at least trigger, oh, right, I should talk about this with the person. So those are the three basic aims. They also actually integrate with one another, which we can go into in detail afterwards. But the idea was, let's really try this. The cause for low participation rates is really multifactorial. And so the intervention to really challenge that and change that must be multifactorial.
Yeah, so interesting. You know, a couple of questions based on what you just said. One is, what is a community scientist? And then two, I love this pop-up to remind people to have the discussion, but it doesn't change the bias when a doctor may think, oh, no, this patient won't participate, or this patient won't follow through, or this patient won't. And so, you know, it's one thing to prompt, but then prompting doesn't mean that there'll be real follow through.
Yeah, so I'll answer the second one first, and then don't let me forget about the first one, which I'm already forgetting about. But the rationale of that prompt actually was based on both literature and on a lot of formative work. And the reason for that is that, in fact, and at Columbia, one of the co-investigators had done prior work that really found that, you know, docs were offering clinical trials, but not as often as one might think. And much of their rationale when they weren't offering it was the thought that patients wouldn't be open to it. The patients actually were saying, gee, you know, I'd be totally open to this if somebody told me about it. And so that was part of the rationale of getting it to the docs and getting it to the patients. And so activating patients to bring that data with them and to ask their docs, and also teaching them about clinical trials and having a clinical trials patient navigator as part of this to help patients think through kind of what their questions are and how to ask it is one important part of the intervention. For the docs, you're right, this isn't going to get at every single bias. We also did grand rounds with folks beforehand. We did a lot of formative work. One of the things that we actually heard from folks is that they were quite open to offering clinical trials. Pretty much everybody agreed with the concept of clinical trials, and they were willing to offer the patients that. How much of that is social desirability? It's always a challenge. But most of the people basically who were actually working at academic medical centers are pretty much bought into the idea of research and the importance of clinical trials. So that's not so much of a challenge. The challenge for them were a couple told. One is the time that it takes to actually enroll someone in a clinical trial. The one thing that this grant does not do is change the infrastructure in terms of having adequate people to be able to go through all the components that are needed to truly enroll someone. So what we're providing is the information at the right time, but it builds on whatever infrastructure the clinical trials office currently has. So that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. In terms of advantage of sustainability, but disadvantage, it's going to be limited by the limitations of a clinical trials office. That being said, if we're able to actually get more people to talk about this, then the clinical trials office, it kind of puts pressure on the clinical trials office to see how many more they could get, which theoretically could then, you know, be a way of really pushing for more resources because you're showing a clear need.
Right. And then community scientists.
Community scientists are individuals who live within the community who have a tremendous interest in science. And in this case, in particular for cancer clinical trials. And so these are folks who actually want to get additional training. about clinical trials and about clinical research. And so these folks vary tremendously. And Zorina, you've worked with a bunch of them, and I'll turn it over to you in a second, but the ones we've had folks who run patient navigator programs. We have individuals who have either a personal or a familial or friend relationship with somebody who's had cancer, who's really interested in getting involved and having their voice heard to be able to affect what happens. But Zorina, do you want to add some more about that?
The group, the part of the DISTRUPT project that offers clinical trials is City College. So they run that particular program. The people that normally sign up have been exposed to some information during our DISTRUPT various activities. For example, we started having community studios, which are similar to focus groups, back in April of 2022. And the folks who attended, there were about 9 community studios conducted. And the difference from a community studio point of view is that the community does more talking as opposed to a focus group when maybe the presenters are doing more talking. And so there was great interest. There were many questions, and people really wanted to get involved. So that was and the community studios, when offered, and that was a little bit more down the line, came about, months later. But I think the community, which we kind of recruited into the process, came from community-based organizations and faith-based organizations that have had standing relationships with, working on the projects. So these are people who are very invested in the health of the community and definitely are very vocal with things that are happening in the community and willing to share. And they want a lot of information. So sharing information is a key to this project. Sharing information, being realistic about it, letting them have their say. One of the things they said early on was that we did a presentation and it seemed cold and clinical of the group as we presented. And so we had to go back and look at that and make adjustments. And many times patients, and particularly patients of color, do get that sort of feeling when seeing a provider. They feel that the provider is, so clinical, they're not caring about them. They're just offering flat out information, and people want to be in a relationship. They want to, their provider to get to know them personally, and make recommendations based on who they are as people. And so we heard that, and we have incorporated that into many different modules of training that we've been offering out in the community. So they say that they wanted to understand what it takes to make a personal decision about clinical trials and how that might impact them. And, we early on also addressed the issue of ethics and ethical concerns, because that was very important to the community. There's been many missteps and abuses. So they wanted to discuss, like Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee study. They kind of just wanted to get this stuff out and say, hey, look at what happened to us. This is wrong. And so we listened attentively, and on many things we had to agree because, although there are better ethical processes in place now, there's still some mishaps. So we wanted to be upfront and out in the open about DISTRUPT and what we hope to achieve, and make it clear that we wanted to hear their voices in the process. And so the first year or so, we had been doing many presentations out in the community in person on Zoom. and working within faith-based organizations, going out as a team, and so they could see us up close and personal, and presenting some information about the DISTRUPT process and clinical information as well. So we, Dr. Bickell offered clinical information. We've had other subject matter experts come out and talk about any clinical trials they've been involved in, and how that process works. So I think that the relatability of providers to the community really stands out in the forefront of the success of the BIPOC community learning about clinical trials, being open to learning, but also that we as part of the team, they want to know that we're listening to them. And we have incorporated many of their ideas into the project.
One of the things I read about in preparing to have this discussion with both of you was that how different groups respond to a cancer diagnosis is different, right? So members of the majority group lead by looking for clinical trials, seeking them out, whereas that's not the knee-jerk response for members in the BIPOC community. And frankly, even though I'm a doctor, when I have thought about clinical trials, I think about it as the Hail Mary, right? The thing that you go to when everything else fails. And that thought process has to change, right? Because you don't have to wait for, the last bit of thing that you can try. But I also wanted to talk to you, Reverend Dr. Costello, about what your thoughts were about clinical trials before you joined Stand Up to Cancer and the DISTRUPT work that you're doing. And also, as a community leader, how do you decide which projects, which organizations, which whatever to partnership really pass the sniff test?
What I thought, I actually did not have that much experience with clinical trials before I came into this project, but because I saw patients at the bedside as well, I have had conversations with patients as they were in a decision-making process, or finding out information late stages of cancer, and people are struggling. And we know that the statistics, particularly in breast cancer, Black women have lower rates of breast cancer, but higher rates of death. And so that part of it I knew about and I was aware about, but I've learned a lot through this process. So it's now, part of my practice to want to talk to people about it, to want to connect them with the right resources, because that's another thing. They really want resources, not just resources for clinical trials, but overall resources. There's a gap in the information in BIPOC communities that they have about health and navigating medical systems. So we've incorporated a lot of information and resources along the way to help with that. The way that I kind of inherited some of the organizations that I work with, although others have joined on, because when I first started, there was about maybe 40 or more faith-based and community-based institutions that used to attend a monthly spiritual care breakfast that we held for faith-based leaders. During COVID, that whole thing sort of disbanded because we couldn't meet in person anymore. And we since ceased to have those meetings. But I've maintained relationships with a lot of those organizations, and their integrity as an organization, how they care about their members, whether faith-based or community-based, the fact that they're willing to go a step further and, not just be concerned about people's spiritual life, but about their health in vivo. And so that, and their willingness to be trained as the program I run for community health advisors, or as citizen scientists. I mean, there's so much enthusiasm once people learn and feel a part of the institutions that are offering this information, because now they feel connected. They feel connected to us. They feel connected into the institutions that are involved in a new way. And I think that that helps me to see who's going to be willing to be involved, who's going to have programs, who's going to invite us, have us listen to where they want us to go. So it's a synergy between the institution, the program, and the community.
Yeah, I almost wish we, just like we have the direct to consumer marketing for drugs, that there was that kind of, in your face public service announcements, direct advertising about clinical trials, so that people knew about it before they need it, so that doctors know about it before before their patient needs it, so the patients know about it before they need it. So
that is, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that is, I saw Zorina about to say this. That is the whole point of what the community aim is to really get that and change.
Most of the people that come to these meetings may not need a clinical trial or may not even have cancer, but they connected because either a friend, a family member, or someone who's had cancer. And so we're trying to be proactive about giving the education ahead of time, so that in the event that someone they know, they keep spreading this message, they can be an ambassador as well of the information.
Absolutely. Thank you guys.
And to change, to get at exactly the way you started this, clinical trials are not when you're at death's door.
Right.
Some of them are, but many of them are really to try to prevent you from even getting to that point.
Right.
So,
what do you guys see as the top, say, 3 to 5 most significant barriers to achieving diversity in clinical trials, and how to overcome them?
you want to go first? You want me to go first?
Even though we have this effort, which I think is a great effort, there's still so many gaps and communities that we're not reaching. We targeted specific communities based on cancer rates in the city, but we hope that eventually, as you were saying, with the PSAs, there's going to be more information given in the clinics, do some videos that we created to continue to spread this message. So we do think about sustainability, and we do think about dissemination in a larger view. But right now we're limited into what we said we would do in the project. But it certainly warrants further attention beyond this particular DISTRUPT project.
Yeah, so I agree totally with what Zorina was saying. I think there are a few major hurdles, some of which we can address and some of which we can't. So in terms of getting messaging out, that's a critical one. The part that's hard, I think, to change is, there are a few, so take it aim by aim. So within the community, one of the big challenges in terms of joining a clinical trial has to do with overcoming issues of mistrust. In fact, talking about Henrietta Lacks, talking about Tuskegee, that's all important and fine. But one of the things that we heard loud and clear in the community engagement studios was it actually has a lot more to do with how people are currently being treated by the health system. And so when people are not being treated well, they are more rightfully mistrustful. So I think that no matter how good a message we get out about clinical trials, if we don't work on how we actually treat people, we're still going to have a huge problem. So get the message out, but really need to work on behaviors.
Yeah.
So that's one big one. In terms of the delivery system part of it, we really need to make sure that we have adequate resources to truly be able to both get the information to the docs at the time that they need it, but also have enough people to be able to really follow through on enrollment processes. And I think that's a huge issue at current time in all the sites. And then in terms of the research community, one of the other huge problems in terms of clinical trials is that a huge reason why we don't recruit that many people to clinical trials is that we actually don't have trials for a lot of the patients. And so part of what we're also doing is collecting clinical information about folks for whom, we don't have a match list because there's no trial that's actually up and running at any of the institutions that would be relevant for that patient. And so we're really trying to close that loop so that there are groups of patients for whom, there should be trials, but we don't have any, so we can't enroll anybody. So it's really trying to get at it from all the different things.
Right.
The other piece that is
another, if I could just say one more thing as well, another barrier is the community has expressed that we, not just our institution, but others throughout the city, are lacking in mental health, psychological, and emotional support. When even during any health journey, they are feeling nervous and anxious, especially when a condition is, quite serious. And we really don't offer that. We're offering the healthcare for the body, but we don't particularly have the resources to offer the psychological and emotional supports that they need. There's some, I'm not saying there's none, but what they expressed is they have difficulty finding it, or there's just a lack of, there's a lack of psychiatrists, there's a lack of psychologists, and especially with COVID, the system, whatever resources there were, became more overwhelmed since COVID. So it's hard for them to get that type of support in general.
let alone Spanish speaking.
Yes.
The one other thing that I didn't talk about at all, that's a huge piece of this, that's also a bit of a barrier at present, is the IT portion, which is, how do we identify patients who actually are truly at a treatment decision point when trials would be more relevant, and really be able to categorize and classify both patients and trials, and then match them. And that's been quite an undertaking. And I mean, we're doing it, we're getting better at it, and we work on refining the algorithms all of the time. And then also tailoring them and refining them at each of the different institutions. But that also has been quite an undertaking.
Yeah. Also, similar to what both of you are saying in preparing to talk to you, I heard an interview with Dr. Lola Fayanju. She's at the University of Pennsylvania, does a lot of work in breast cancer research. And in terms of the whole trust issue, just like you said, Dr. Bickell, she said, you don't have to go as far back as Tuskegee or Henrietta Lacks. She said, just see how people are being treated today. And so she said something that I thought was really interesting, which was, we need to turn the question upside down. And it's not about a mistrust issue, but what has the health system done to earn that trust? And what are they doing going forward to inspire that confidence? And so I thought that was really interesting. And another barrier that they talked about was the lack of diversity amongst researchers. Right. And so one of the things that they tend to do, and I think it's similar to the community scientist aspect, is while there may not be as diversity amongst PIs, there's a lot of diversity within our teams. And so they leverage that, whether it's the front desk person or the medical assistant, or so they leverage the diversity within their own internal community to reach out to patients, to speak to patients in a way, maybe in their concurrent language, or, people who share a similar culture or background, in terms of helping patients feel more comfortable enrolling in a clinical trial.
And Zorina, you can talk about the videos in how that was approached and who participated.
We have developed a series of videos. Some of them are still being edited, but many members from the community and staff participated in these creation of the videos to talk about not just clinical trials, but the healthcare system overall, and some of the barriers, some of the mishaps, some of the places, you know, the places where they have personal stories of things that have happened to them. They talk sometimes about, you know, many of the social determinants of health issues, the housing, food scarcity. All of these issues impact how people think about the healthcare system and eventually, if needed, clinical trials. So we are in the process of getting these videos into some of the clinical areas, and we're very close, right? I think we'll be there soon, and getting them in other social media arenas, and not just our institution, but the other 3 institutions that we are partnered with. So the videos have community members from faith-based organizations to people who represent housing, small business association. So there's a variety of people. They are in English and in Spanish. And we have one group that's part of the Japanese community. So we're really trying to have diversity in the video so that when people see them, they feel that it's relatable for them.
Absolutely. Should we, I have tons more questions for you, but I wanted to open it up to our participants. And Lindia, can you see if people have questions, and can we start responding to them?
Yeah, there's one in the QA, and she also put it in the chat. She
Okay.
said, how are we incentivizing both PIs and clinician leads, as well as enrollees, to increase diversity in the trial cohort? I guess it's Cynthia Clayto from Mount Sinai Innovation Partners.
Yeah, so I think that's directed to me. So the way that we're incentivized, so I'll tell you how we're incentivizing clinicians, and then we'll talk about patients. So, so for clinicians, the way we started this whole thing, even during proposal development, was talking with basically clinical opinion leaders within different areas. So we were focused on breast, now it's liver and lung. So all 3 of those, and talking to basically high volume clinical leaders within those cancer specialties to get a sense of what they thought the issues were, what helps with trial enrollment, what gets in the way of trial enrollment, what would be useful, what would be a hindrance, just to at least get a sense of how do things currently work, what's working and what's not working, and what are your thoughts about how this could work or should work. And in general, that's how I start projects, because they know way more than I do about the particulars of whatever we're looking at. And in the process of doing that, so some of them are actually on the grant because their inputs are so critical and we need to pay for a % effort. And then in the formative parts of this, talking to as many people as we could to really get their inputs about the issues that I just mentioned. And in doing that, hoping to really engage people and to take their views and opinions into account in order to design some kind of intervention that actually has a chance of working. So that's the very first step, because you have to have clinical buy-in. So it has to be something that's important to folks, and figure out what works and what doesn't and what could work, and how to put it into play. And so that was just the basement level. And then refining as we go along. I'm probably bugging these people way more than they would ever like, but to really make it fit for them, that's the only way that I've figured out to do this. For patients, patients get get incentivized in that, you know, part of this is simply just being able to bring them the education and the information, but we also do give them an incentive for their participation. So after they responded to the surveys. Remember, just this is incentivizing them to participate in DISTRUPT. DISTRUPT is really an educational intervention and an informational intervention. This is not enrollment in a specific clinical trial for their treatment of their cancer. It's enrollment in DISTRUPT that will tell them about potential trials for their cancer. So it's a little bit different. So I'm not paying them to join a particular treatment trial, because there, I think, are important issues about doing that, and I don't want to be coercive. This is really paying them for their time and effort in answering surveys, for being part of DISTRUPT.
Yeah, we also incentivize the community members / organizations by honoring their time, which in the past, when researchers have gone into communities, they oftentimes, you know, don't offer the community anything. And not only that, they never go back and say what the results of these studies have been over years and years. So not just our institutions, but throughout the city. So we heard a lot of that. But we pay them to come to meetings, to offer ideas. And now we're entering a new phase of co-design partners. So we'll have other types of programs, more creative programs with these particular co-design partners. And those programs, which you'll be seeing when we have flyers, are going to be taking place throughout the city. And we're offering, we're getting into a memorandum of agreement so that they know what they're going to do, we know what we're going to do. And so it's built into the DISTRUPT grant that a portion of the funding goes right back into the community.
And the other piece, just to get to one of the questions you asked earlier about the Community Scientists Institute, was, you know, noticing that we really needed to develop more community scientists. And so that's how that whole program came into existence. Originally was a 6-week program that there was such enthusiastic interest and support of it that it's expanded to 8 weeks, and they were able to get it to be a certificate granting program at City College. So now that's being offered each year for a wide audience.
So interesting. How about tackling or targeting young people, like, you know, teenagers, or, you know, ambassadors for their family and for their communities?
Yeah, so one of the things, do you want to talk about the student ambassadors, Zorina? Don't need to talk about it.
We are recruiting and having students take the city programs, so they have to get certified in all the city courses, and they're going to be working alongside investigators during these co-design programs, which I just mentioned. So many of them are coming from various community groups. Some of them are students at City. I have a few at Mount Sinai who have asked to join, and one in particular, he's been with us for over 2 years. And so we're very mindful of this. I think that, of course, more can be done, but Mount Sinai also has other programs with youth through the education department and other leaders. And I've been working with ODI on a youth advocacy climate change program, which we piloted last summer. So a lot of the ideas of learning about just the field of research, the field of what institutions do, has been part of what they have been learning in that program. And we're getting ready to start another cohort this spring. So we're mindful of this. I get asked to join many different projects so that I can help connect not just adults, but youth into various aspects of science that are important, and that when they learn about it, they become so excited because they feel that they never would have been able to be part of an institution like Mount Sinai that they felt that they weren't invited to the table. So it's a small group right now, but I believe it's going to keep growing.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much for the work you do. In the last 5 minutes that we have, can I just ask you, what have you learned since starting and working with Stand Up to Cancer that you didn't know before? And how long do you guys think we have to see a significant increase in BIPOC members' participation in clinical trials?
What have I learned since working with Stand Up to Cancer and working across? I don't know that I've learned this anew, but it's certainly been reinforced. Is you've seen one institution, you've seen one institution, you've seen one clinic, you've seen one clinic, and that the process of being able to design an intervention and really modify it and tailor it to fit each site is a huge effort and should never be underestimated and takes a lot of time and hand-holding. And in terms of how long will it take to really truly impact the proportion of population that of BIPOC populations that participate in clinical trials, it's going to take way longer than the duration of this grant, because it's like with any kind of illness. It doesn't usually happen overnight. It's not going to get cured overnight. It's going to take a huge effort of ongoing persistence and modification and refinement, and it's got to happen across all these different levers and points. And so it's community, it's delivery system, it's IT, it's attitudes, it's knowledge, it's beliefs, it's resources, it's attention to gaps and development of new research protocol. It's just all of it together, and that's going to take years, in all honesty.
Well, thank you for chipping at the effort, because we have to start somewhere, and now is now.
I also think policy issues amongst these institutions is an important thing to consider, because even though people know the right thing to do, there's often policies in place that become barriers. And it's really up to the institutional leaders to begin to look at those policies and see how they can be more inclusive of the BIPOC community. I think that's very challenging. And just learning about the various cultures of these institutions and how our cross-sectional communication happens or does not happen at times is quite a learning curve for me.
Yeah. And one of the important pieces that we keep coming back to is, how do we change institutional culture and policy? And and we've been chipping away at that, and and I have to say, the cancer center directors have actually been wonderful across the 3 sites. And they've actually donated monies to support individuals for scholarships to the Community Scientists Institute, and have really been open and helping and supportive of all the AI movements that we've been working on. And they've been quite supportive. So we've been very lucky in that. But there's more to do.
I'll speak for everyone and how lucky we are to have both of you in our community, and for lending us your time, your expertise, and sharing with us all the wonderful work that's happening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.